Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and welcome back to another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. So today is July the 17th, and it's been another hot one. Though it makes us mad seeing that our crops are out there suffering, this is actually a good time to evaluate those fields or parts of fields that may have the biggest challenges below ground. Those droughty, wrapped up, or wilted plants are pretty good indicators of root limitations. Whether it be sidewall or zone compaction, fertility issues, root diseases, or just low moisture holding capacity, let's be sure to take note of those areas now so that we can focus on management attention to those areas before planting next year's crop, and also use them to set some proper yield expectations for this fall's harvest. Now, this week on the podcast, let's talk about a couple things. First of all, how this heat and drought might affect successful pollination, and secondly, let's address the question of fungicide timing with the stress our crop is under right now. So grab your cup of coffee and let's talk agronomy. So let's start with how the current heat and drought might affect pollination time, as a lot of our corn is tasseling, or at least pushing tassel, or will be pushing tassel in the next week or so. One of my fellow agronomists, Adam Mayer, put out a really good article earlier this week addressing this topic. So I want to share with you some of his thoughts. Specifically, he outlined the following temperature risk levels. So he talked about, when we're just above that 86 degree Fahrenheit kind of critical temperature for corn, and, pollen shed often slows after this point. And though, the good news is most of the shed occurs in the morning, before that peak heat occurs. As far as yield risk, it's usually manageable as long as soil moisture is adequate. Now, what happens when we jump to those kind of low to mid 90s? That's, if we have pollen there and exposed silks, they can begin to lose viability, especially in those lower humidity conditions. And, then risk does rise if it lasts several days during this R1 growth period. Now, what about if we get greater than 95 degrees and, we're sitting in that dry or lower relative humidity conditions? Exposed silks can desiccate or die at that point, and pollen can be damaged after it's shed. And of course, that can cause scattered or tip kernel loss if silks are delayed or just dried out. And then if we get over that 100-degree temperature, that extreme heat can actually kill pollen. And, 1 or 2 days are often buffered, but boy, repeated hot, dry days, they're really at high risk. So what about the drought itself? And, so if we think about drought prior to silking, maybe that 2 weeks prior to silking, where we got some of that going on right now, that silk growth begins actually before silks appear, so drought can slow the emergence of those silks. And it could give us about 3 to 4% yield loss per day under severe stress. Now, severe stress of drought during the silking and pollination shed, that's absolutely the most critical period. Silks may not emerge in time, or they may become non-receptive. And that looks like it could give us up to 8% yield loss per day. And then finally, severe stress 2 weeks after the silking period. We've got fertilized kernels, but they could abort, especially near those tips of those ears. And of course, that can relay up to maybe a 6% yield loss per day. So, he also reminds us that silks, they remain receptive for about 10 days. And the most successful fertilization, of course, occurs in that first 4 to 5 days after silk emergence. And a single tassel can shed pollen for several days, and a field may shed pollen for up to 2 weeks, which that, of course, helps us buffer some of those shorter heat events. Danger comes when stress is intense and just continuous throughout the main silking window. So, with this in mind, and knowing unfortunately we have really no ability to change the weather, I just wanted to share this information to simply help set expectations as we move through these next very critical weeks in our corn yield potential development. Now, speaking of managing the stresses of heat and drought, I've asked my friend and colleague here, who's the Michigan Syngenta crop protection agronomist, Calvin Canfield, asked him to join me on the podcast today to discuss some of these ins and outs of applying fungicide to corn and in these drought and high temperature conditions. So, Calvin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Charles. Thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. Well, Calvin, I've gotten a lot of calls these past few days about what might be the best timing for fungicide applications. And so I just wonder if you could help our listeners weigh out those risks and possible rewards associated with making this decision with the current environmental conditions.
Yeah, so when we talk timing, I think of two different times, crop stage and where are we at with some weather conditions. You nailed it with how hot we're getting. In general, I try to avoid the hottest times of the day to apply anything to a crop. But our chemical doesn't do any good in the jug. We got to manage some decisions when we're trying to cross a lot of acres, and our chemistry does no good in the jug. So it's better to get it applied and start protecting that crop against the abiotic and biotic stressors that we have out there. When it comes to crop staging, the VT or tasseling to R1 stages is where we've seen the most consistent return on our investment of a high quality fungicide. We're seeing the benefit to getting out before the diseases are really going rampant. And we're going to cover a lot of that plant tissue. We're going to get down deeper into the canopy to get to maybe some silking. So a chemistry, a high quality fungicide that has multiple modes of action, something containing an SDHI chemistry, such as a depidin. We have some good ear rot control in addition to the plant health benefits and broad spectrum control against a lot of those foliar diseases. So timing is very important, but the environment. Where you talked a little bit about our little bit of stress from the environment being dry. With the high quality fungicides such as adepidin, we don't just get activity on the diseases, but we're also seeing plant health. We're mitigating that stress, and we're able to work through a little bit of this droughtiness, help the plant perform better with water use efficiency, and we're seeing a lot of benefit in these more stressful conditions for our crop. Oftentimes, I get questions such as, if I'm going out and I'm going to apply, what adjuvant should I use? What machinery should I use? When it comes to adjuvants, I recommend a high quality non-ionic surfactant that is approved for a fungicide, a later stage application. Always work with a trusted crop advisor to pick out the best adjuvant. And when we talk about equipment that we're going to use, if we're going to fly on with a helicopter, airplane, drone, we want to get the best coverage. So that non-ionic surfactant is going to help spread the fungicide out and provide the best coverage to protect our crop. And then we talk a little bit about corn, but also want to address soybeans. Not too long ago, we had the summer solstice. We're going to start seeing flowers if we haven't already seen flowers out in the field. And a early mentor of mine, Charles, always said after the summer solstice, if are green, white mold is keen. So I know I've been mowing my lawn for the last couple of weeks, twice a week, because it's been pretty darn green. And I think we need to watch out for that white mold in our soybean crop as well as all the other diseases that are out there in our corn. In fact, Charles, just today, I noticed that the Crop Protection Network had 3 counties in the state of Michigan that confirmed tar spot. So we know the disease is here. We know that we need to get out and be more proactive than reactive to prevent the spread of more tar spot in our corn crop and really protect the bushels, protect all of the investment that we've already made into our crop this year.
Well, Calvin, I really appreciate you kind of sharing those thoughts on there because, again, we're getting a lot of questions out there right now, and want to make sure that we certainly make the best decisions as we're continuing to invest in that crop and give us a chance for the greatest potential return at the end of the day. So, Again, appreciate your insights and sharing that with our folks today. Certainly a lot of things to think about as we go forward. So to wrap up this week's episode, here's a couple of key takeaways I hope you're going to kind of think about. One is, of course, the hotter it gets, the longer it lasts, the greater the risk of our yield loss. It tends to go up, but unfortunately, we have little control over the weather, but we can use what we see out there to ones that yield expectations, and two, look for areas to improve for management in future years. And then the second big takeaway I think is about these fungicides, and they certainly have that potential to play a key role not only in stress mitigation, but also to protect from disease and protect that stalk integrity and hopefully give us that greatest yield potential at the end of the day. So I thank you everybody again for tuning into this week's Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe, and I'll see you in the field.